A Persian king once captured a Roman emperor alive and put him to work as a footstool. Another conqueror stacked severed heads into pyramids. Today, 10 forgotten empires that actually built the world we live in. Let's go. Number 10. The Xiongnu, 209 BC. The northern frontier of China. A young steppe prince named Modu kills his father, takes the throne, and over the next 20 years does something nobody on the steppe had managed before. He stops the tribes from fighting each other and points them all in the same direction, south. By the time he's finished, his confederation runs from Manchuria across to eastern Kazakhstan. The exact borders are fuzzy. Nomadic states don't draw lines on maps the way settled ones do, but Chinese sources describe a field army of 300,000 mounted archers. That number is almost certainly inflated, the way most ancient army numbers are, but even at half or a third, it's a serious force. In 200 BC, the founder of the Han dynasty marches north personally to deal with the nomad problem. Modu lets him march, then surrounds him at a place called Baidang, with what the chronicles describe as an overwhelming force. The Son of Heaven spends 7 days trapped on a freezing mountain, watching his cavalry slowly starve. He doesn't die. He buys his way out, and for roughly 60 years after that, the most powerful settled state on Earth sends annual gifts north to the Xiongnu. Silk, grain, wine, and Han princesses married off to the steppe ruler. The Chinese called the arrangement He Qin, peace through kinship. Modern historians mostly call it what it functionally was, tribute, dressed up in court protocol. Quick note on the Great Wall, because this gets oversimplified online. The wall you see in tourist photos is mostly Ming Dynasty, built 1,500 years after Modu. But the idea of a continuous northern defensive system, connecting older walls built by the warring states into one strategic line, does come out of this period. Qin Shi Huang ordered it just before Modu unified the steppe, and the Han kept extending it. The Xiongnu didn't cause the wall, exactly, but they're a big part of why generation after generation of Chinese dynasties kept rebuilding it. What the Xiongnu actually left behind is harder to see and more important. They were the first steppe people to organize themselves on a scale that worked. Decimal military units, a left wing and a right wing under the central court, a sacred royal lineage that gave the whole structure legitimacy. Whether they literally invented this or inherited pieces of it from earlier groups is debated. But every later steppe empire, the Turks, the Uyghurs, the Khitans, and eventually the Mongols, operates on a recognizably similar template. Genghis Khan, 1,200 years later, is building on patterns the Xiongnu either created or codified first. Then there's the Hun question. Around 150 AD, the western branch of the Xiongnu, after a long civil war and Chinese counterpressure, disappears from East Asian records. They move west. 2 centuries later, in the 370s, a people called the Huns appears on the Volga, smashes the Goths, and pushes the whole northern barbarian world into the Roman frontier. Are the Huns of Attila literally the Xiongnu of Modu? Historians have been fighting about this for 100 years. The linguistic evidence is suggestive but partial. Genetic studies in the last decade have found some shared markers in elite burials, but not a clean answer. Archaeologically, there are continuities and discontinuities. The honest answer is probably some connection, almost certainly not a direct one-to-one identity, and we don't fully know. What's not in dispute is the shape of it. A shockwave hits the eastern steppe. Centuries later, something hits the western steppe. Rome's western half collapses inside the chain reaction. The Xiongnu didn't leave us books. They left the conditions for everything that came after. Number 9. The Göktürks, Mongolia. The mid-500s AD. A clan of ironworkers, vassal smiths serving a steppe overlord, revolts. Within about 15 years, their leaders have built a state that, at its widest stretch, runs from Manchuria almost to the Black Sea. Quick caveat, because the original framing of largest contiguous land empire ever is wrong. The Mongols, the Russians, and the British all dwarfed it later. But for the 6th century, this is enormous. Estimates put it somewhere between 4 and 6 million square kilometers, depending on which year you're measuring and how you count tributary zones. Either way, it's the dominant power across most of Inner Asia, built in roughly one generation. These are the Turks. Not the modern Turkish nation, the original Turk people, whose name every Turkic-speaking population alive today still carries. Turkey, yes, but also Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, the Tatars, the Uyghurs, the Yakuts up in Siberia. Something like 200 million Turkic speakers, spread across roughly a third of the longitudes on Earth, descended linguistically and politically from a confederation that lasted less than 2 centuries as a unified state. The Göktürks did something that genuinely is rare. They sent embassies, more or less simultaneously, to Tang China in the east, to Sasanian Persia in the south, and to Byzantium in the west. And all three treated them as a peer power. In 568, a Göktürk envoy named Maniak shows up in Constantinople with a proposal: a joint war against Sasanian Iran, plus a new silk route that cuts the Persian middlemen out. The Byzantines agree, send their own embassy back across roughly 5,000 kilometers of difficult ground, and the alliance actually happens. It's one of the earliest well-documented direct diplomatic exchanges between the Mediterranean and Inner Asia, though there had been Greek and Bactrian contacts much earlier. The scale of this one, though, is different. And then there are the inscriptions. Around 730 AD, on the Orkhon River in central Mongolia, somebody carves an obituary. 2 of them, actually, for the Khagan Bilga and his brother Kul-Tagin. They were discovered by Russian and Danish scholars in the late 1880s, deciphered in 1893. They're the oldest surviving texts in any Turkic language, and what's striking about them isn't just their age, it's the tone. I did not become Khagan over a rich people. I became Khagan over a poor and broken people. With my brother Kul-Tagin we worked, so the name of the Turkic people would not be lost. We did not sleep at night. We did not rest by day. That's not court flattery filtered through a Chinese chronicler. That's the ruler's own voice, give or take a few rough patches in the translation. The Göktürks fell in the 740s to a coalition of their own subjects, including the next people on this list. But the script they invented, the political vocabulary they wrote down, and the very category of Turkic people as a self-conscious thing, that all survives. The Seljuks pick it up. So do the Ottomans. So does modern Turkey, which built its founding mythology partly around the Orkhon stones. State that lasted 200 years. Identity that's still running 1400 later. Number 8. The Uyghur Khaganate, 744 AD. The Göktürks fall apart. The people who finish them off and take over are called the Uyghurs. And here's where the steppe playbook changes. The standard pattern for nomad empires is raid the settled south, extract tribute, fight over the spoils, eventually fracture. The Uyghurs run a different play. In 755, the Tang dynasty, at that point arguably the most powerful state on earth, nearly collapses from an internal rebellion led by a general named An Lushan. The emperor, out of options, asks the Uyghur Khagan to come south and save him. The Uyghurs do. They retake Luoyang, retake Chang'an, prop the dynasty back up, and then send the invoice. For the next 80 years or so, The Tang pays the Uyghurs in silk on a regular schedule as part of formal treaties. At the high end, contemporary sources mention shipments of hundreds of thousands of bolts of silk a year going north to the Uyghur capital. The numbers in any single year are debated, but the structural fact isn't. China is paying steppe protection money in bulk fabric, and the Uyghurs are turning around and selling that silk west through Sogdian merchants to Persia, Byzantium, the new Abbasid Caliphate. For about a century, the Uyghurs are sitting on a major node of the Silk Road and collecting tolls from both directions. And they do something with the money no steppe empire had done before. They build a real city. Ordu Balik, on the Orkhon River, same valley as the Göktürk inscriptions, was a planned capital with thick stone walls, a palace complex, foreign quarters for Sogdian and Chinese merchants, temples, workshops. Russian and Mongolian expeditions mapped it starting in 1889, and the ruins are still visible today. It wasn't the size of Chang'an, and it wasn't the size of medieval Baghdad, but for a people whose ancestors had lived in tents on a strict seasonal rotation, it was a civilizational shift. In 762, the Uyghur Khagan goes to Luoyang on a tribute trip and meets a community of Sogdian merchants who follow a religion called Manichaeism, a hybrid faith founded in 3rd century Persia, drawing on Zoroastrian, Christian, and Buddhist material. It had been persecuted everywhere it spread, by Rome, by the Sasanians, by the Tang. The Khagan converts. And then, more remarkably, his court does, and the religion becomes the official cult of the Khaganate for several decades. This is the only sustained example of Manichaeism as a state religion anywhere in recorded history. How deeply it penetrated the general population is debated. Court religion and popular religion often aren't the same thing, but at the level of royal sponsorship and elite identity, it's unique. In 840, a rival Turkic group called the Kyrgyz comes down from the Yenisei, sacks Ordu Balik, and the Uyghur Khaganate ends. But the Uyghur people don't end. They move south into the Tarim Basin, into the oases of what is now Xinjiang, and they build a second civilization there. Agricultural, urban, multi-religious, literate. Manichaean for a while, then increasingly Buddhist, eventually Muslim. The script they refined during this period, derived ultimately from Sogdian, which descends from Aramaic, gets adopted by the Mongols under Genghis Khan, who couldn't read or write but recognized he needed a system for governing. The Mongols pass it to the Manchus. The Manchus use a modified version of it to administer China for almost 3 centuries. A form of it is still in use in Inner Mongolia today. So, a nomad empire that built a city, sponsored a banned religion at the level of the throne, and whose alphabet ended up being the administrative script of a quarter of Asia for the better part of a millennium. Not bad for the underdog of this list. Number 7. The Kushans, a museum in Mathura in northern India. Behind glass, a sandstone figure from the late 1st or early 2nd century AD, seated, robed, hand-raised in a teaching gesture. It's one of the earliest surviving images of the Buddha as a human being. Here's the thing about that. For roughly 4 centuries after the Buddha's death, his followers refused to depict him in human form. He showed up in art as a footprint, an empty throne, a wheel, a tree under which something important happened. The figure was absent on purpose. Then, in the 1st and early 2nd centuries AD, in 2 different regions, Mathura on the Ganges Plain and Gandhara in what's now northern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan, the rule quietly breaks. Both traditions are inventing the human Buddha at more or less the same time, and historians still argue about which came first and how much they borrowed from each other. What's not debated is that both regions were inside the same state, the Kushans. They start out as one branch of a confederation called the Yuezhi, pushed west out of the borderlands of China around the 2nd century BC, partly under pressure from the Xiongnu we just talked about. They drift across Central Asia for several generations, settle in Bactria, roughly modern northern Afghanistan, and around the 1st century AD, a leader named Kujula Kadphises pulls the branches together and crosses the Hindu Kush. By the time of Kanishka, conventionally dated to the early 2nd century AD, the exact date is contested, with proposals ranging from about 78 to 127. The empire stretches from Central Asia down across the Indus and into the Gangetic Plain. Population numbers for the ancient world are mostly guesswork, but the territory itself was enormous, and the Kushans plugged it into the trade networks running between Rome, Parthian Iran, and Han China. The Roman gold flow is real and documented. Pliny the Elder complained about a steady drain of Roman bullion eastward to pay for silk, spices, gems, and other luxuries. His figure of 100 million sesterces a year is rhetorical. Roman writers loved a round number. But the underlying trade imbalance shows up in coin hoards across India. Plenty of those hoards include Roman aurei that were later restruck or melted down by Kushan mints. And the coinage is where the Kushans get genuinely interesting. Kushan coins are little theological catalogs. King on one side, deity on the other, and the deity rotates. Sometimes Greek, Helios, Heracles. Sometimes Iranian, Mithra, Ahura Mazda, the moon god Mao. Sometimes Indian, Shiva, Skanda. And on a small, famous set of coins under Kanishka, the Buddha himself, with his name in Greek letters next to him. The Buddha had appeared in art before, in reliefs at Gandhara and Mathura, but the coin issue is one of the earliest unambiguous portraits of him on a circulating object. The court is signaling, clearly, that all of these religious traditions sit under one political umbrella. Then there's the council. Buddhist tradition remembers a major doctrinal gathering held in Kashmir under Kanishka's patronage, sometimes called the Fourth Buddhist Council, though Theravada Buddhists don't recognize it as legitimate. The reality is messier than the headline. Mahayana Buddhism, the broader, more devotional, more philosophically ambitious branch, wasn't suddenly invented at one meeting. It had been developing for at least a century before Kanishka, and kept developing for centuries after. But the Kushan period is when many of the foundational Mahayana texts get composed or compiled, and Kushan patronage gives them a launchpad. Trade routes that run north through Kushan territory carry Mahayana into Central Asia, then into China, then onward to Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Tibet, and Mongolia. Today, most of the world's Buddhists are Mahayana, and a lot of that intellectual lineage runs back through Kushan-era texts. The visual side is similar. Gandharan sculpture is a real fusion. Indian religious content, sculpted by artisans working in a tradition that goes back through Bactria to the Hellenistic kingdoms left behind by Alexander's successors. Robe folds and facial features that look almost Mediterranean. Halos that may or may not be borrowed from Iranian sun imagery. The Mathura school is parallel and more clearly Indian in style. Modern Buddhist statuary draws on both. Saying every Buddha in every temple is, in its DNA, Gandharan, overstates one side of a two-sided story. The empire fragments in the 3rd century, squeezed by the rising Sasanians from the west. By around 375, it's effectively gone. What it left is harder to put a price on than gold coins. A religion that today has 500 million followers took much of its current shape, its texts, its imagery, its routes of transmission, under the patronage of a dynasty whose name most people couldn't place on a map. Number 6. The Sasanians. A cliff in southern Iran. Naqsh-e-Rostam. Carved into the rock, a relief 20 meters across, a Persian king on horseback. In front of him, a man in Roman regalia, on his knees. The king has him by the wrist. The Roman is Valerian, emperor of Rome, captured in battle in 260 AD. The Persian is Shapur I. This actually happened. Valerian's capture is one of the few facts in the period that no ancient source disputes. What didn't happen, despite a popular story you'll find on the internet, is the part about Valerian being skinned alive and stuffed in a temple. That comes from one Christian writer, Lactantius, with an obvious axe to grind, writing decades later. Most modern historians treat it as propaganda. The likelier reality is that Valerian spent the rest of his life as a high-status prisoner used for diplomatic theater, then died in captivity, which is humiliating enough. The Sasanian dynasty lasted from 224 to 651 AD, 427 years, and for that entire span, they were the Eastern superpower of late antiquity, Rome's mirror, Byzantium's peer rival. The state Rome could never quite beat and could never quite escape. If your high school history class covered Rome's eastern frontier as a footnote, this is what was actually happening on it. The high water mark comes under Khosrow II between 602 and 628. The Sasanians take Antioch, then Damascus, then Jerusalem, and famously carry off the True Cross, which becomes one of the great propaganda artifacts of the age. They take Egypt, which had been Rome's grain supply for 600 years. They sweep across most of Anatolia. In 626, a Sasanian army camps on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, while their Avar allies attack Constantinople from the European side. For one summer, the Eastern Roman Empire is functionally one city behind walls. Constantinople holds, partly because the Sasanians never had a serious navy. The Emperor Heraclius then pulls off one of the great campaign reversals in military history, marching deep into the Persian heartland and forcing a peace by 628. Both empires come out of it broken, financially, demographically, politically. 4 years later, in 632, a religious movement in Western Arabia that neither superpower had taken seriously consolidates around a new leadership after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Inside a decade, Arab armies are taking the same cities the Sasanians had briefly held, Damascus, Jerusalem, Egypt, and marching east. In 636, at Al-Qadisiyah, they break the main Sasanian field army. In 651, the last Sasanian king dies on the run in eastern Iran. The empire is gone. What it built isn't. The Arab conquerors absorbed Sasanian administration almost wholesale. They didn't have the bureaucratic infrastructure to run an empire of that size, and the Sasanians did. Tax registers, postal relays, provincial governors, court ceremonial, the institution of the vizier, most of it carries over into the Umayyad and especially the Abbasid caliphates, often with the same Persian-speaking officials still doing the same jobs. The idea of the ruler as God's shadow on earth, which becomes a stock phrase in medieval Islamic political theory, is recognizably Sasanian. The Academy of Gondishapur in southwestern Iran is harder to pin down than popular accounts suggest. Some recent historians argue it was less a single grand institution and more a hospital with associated teaching, but it was a real center where Greek, Syriac, Indian, and Persian medical and scientific traditions got mixed. When the Abbasids started their translation movement in the 8th and 9th centuries, Gondishapur scholars were among the first people they recruited. A couple of other Sasanian contributions you'd recognize. Chess wasn't invented in Persia. It came from India as a game called chaturanga, but Sasanian courtiers reworked it into shatranj, and the modern words check and checkmate come from the Persian shah and shahmat. The king is helpless. The architectural vocabulary of the great Iranian dome and the Iwan, the huge vaulted arch open on one side, develops under the Sasanians and becomes the basic toolkit of mosque and palace design across the Islamic world for the next 1,000 years. You can see direct descendants of it in Samarkand, in Isfahan, in Lahore. Calling the Taj Mahal a Sasanian building is too strong. The Taj is a Mughal synthesis with Timurid, Persian, and Indian sources. But the family resemblance is real and traceable. The trickiest legacy is religious. Sasanian Iran was officially Zoroastrian. Zoroastrianism is older than the Sasanians. It goes back at least to the early 1st millennium BC, but the Sasanians were the religion at its peak as a state cult. Zoroastrian theology contains a sharp cosmic dualism between good and evil, a final judgment, a savior figure at the end of time, and a moral accounting after death. There's a long-standing argument among historians of religion that some of these ideas influenced Second Temple Judaism during and after the Persian period, and from there fed into Christianity and Islam. That argument is real and serious, but it's not settled. Scholars like Mary Boyce have pushed it strongly. Others, especially in recent decades, have been more cautious, pointing out that similar apocalyptic ideas develop in several places around the same time, and that the direction of influence is hard to prove. The honest summary is, Zoroastrianism probably contributed to the development of monotheistic eschatology, and the chronology supports it, but 3 world religions got their picture of the end of time from Zoroastrianism is a stronger claim than the evidence justifies. What's solid is the institutional and cultural inheritance, the administrative skeleton of the medieval Middle East, an architectural vocabulary that runs from the Caspian to the Bay of Bengal, the game played on more boards than any other on Earth, and a religious tradition that punched far above the weight of its surviving community, which today numbers somewhere around 100 to 200,000 people worldwide. That's the Sasanians. 2 paragraphs in most Western textbooks doesn't cover it. Number 5. The Khazars. The Lower Volga, around the middle of the 8th century. A Khagan named Bulan is about to do something almost no ruler before or after has done. His state runs from the northern Caucasus up the Volga into the forest zone, with a western reach onto the Crimean coast. Roughly 3 million square kilometers of steppe, river, and woodland. Though, as with any nomadic influenced state, the boundaries shift year to year. To his south, the Abbasid Caliphate has just stopped its push north after decades of war on the Caucasus frontier. To his west, Byzantium is courting him. Khazar princesses marry into the Byzantine imperial family, and one of them, Tsitsak, becomes the mother of Emperor Leo IV, sometimes nicknamed Leo the Khazar. Bulan rules a Turkic people that had originally followed the older shamanist religion of the steppe. His geopolitical problem is the same one every middle-tier state faces. Convert to Islam, and he becomes a junior partner of the Caliphate. Convert to Christianity, and he becomes a junior partner of Byzantium. Either way, sovereignty is on the table. So he picks a third option. He converts to Judaism. Now, how much of the Khazar population actually converted is one of the most argued over questions in medieval history. The royal court and at least part of the aristocracy clearly adopted Judaism. That much is supported by Arabic, Byzantine, and Hebrew sources, plus a small but genuine documentary trail, including a 10th century letter exchanged between the Khazar king Joseph and a Jewish official named Hasdai ibn Shaprut in Muslim Spain. Whether the conversion reached beyond the elite into the general population is much less clear. Some historians think it spread fairly widely in the towns. Others think it stayed mostly with the ruling class. The romantic version, where the whole Khazar nation became Jewish, is a stretch. The minimal version, that the ruling house and a meaningful slice of the aristocracy were Jewish for roughly 2 centuries, is well supported. Even the minimal version is remarkable. The closest comparison is the kingdom of Himyar in southern Arabia, where the ruling dynasty had converted to Judaism in the 4th and 5th centuries, before falling in the 520s. After Himyar, there's no other Jewish-led sovereign state of any size until the founding of modern Israel in 1948. Khazaria sits in that gap, on the Volga, ruled by Turkic-speaking converts. For 3 centuries, the Khazars occupied a position that mattered to 3 civilizations at once. They were the wall on the Caliphate's northern frontier. The Arab-Khazar wars of the 7th and 8th centuries get a paragraph in most Western histories and deserve a chapter. Caliphate armies got pinned down in the Caucasus for decades. Whether the steppe corridor north of the Black Sea would have stayed Muslim if those armies had broken through is a counterfactual nobody can settle, because Byzantium was also fighting on the Caliphate's western flank, and the geography of the Russian forest belt is its own obstacle. But the Khazars were definitely a major part of why the northern expansion stopped where it did. They were also a critical node in the silver trade that built the Viking Age. Scandinavian merchants and raiders, the Rus, came down the rivers of European Russia, carrying furs, slaves, and amber. They traded for Islamic silver coins called dirhams, which were minted as far away as Central Asia, and they carried those coins home. Vast hordes of Abbasid and Samanid dirhams have been excavated across Sweden, Gotland, Denmark, and the Baltic. Many of them came through Khazar territory. Many came via the Bulgars of the Middle Volga, who were Khazar tributaries and then rivals. The cash flow that funded Viking-era expansion is, in part, a Khazar story. In 965, a Rus prince named Sviatoslav of Kiev sacked the Khazar capital, Itil, on the lower Volga. The Khazar state never recovers in the same form. Itil itself has never been definitively located. Archaeologists have candidate sites, but the lower Volga's geography has shifted, and no excavation has produced a smoking gun. Within a couple of generations, the Khazars disappear as a political unit. Their descendants are absorbed into the populations around them: Cumans, Pechenegs, Volga Bulgars, eventually Rus. A footnote, because it gets misused online. A theory from the 1970s, popularized by Arthur Kessler, proposed that European Ashkenazi Jews are largely descended from converted Khazars. Modern genetic studies, multiple, large, by different teams, have not supported this. Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry traces predominantly to the Middle East, with significant European admixture, and only a minor Eastern European component that could plausibly include some Khazar contribution. The Khazar conversion is real, important, and fascinating on its own terms. The genetic claim that grew out of it is not supported by current evidence, and the theory is sometimes weaponized in modern anti-Semitic contexts, which is worth flagging. What the Khazars actually leave behind is a model, a state that chose its religion as an instrument of policy and made the choice stick for 2.5 centuries. A pivot point where the Islamic, Christian, Viking, and steppe worlds touched at the same place at the same time. Take Khazaria off the map of early medieval Eurasia, and the trade flows, the religious frontiers, and the geopolitics of the Caucasus all stop making sense. Number 4. The Mali Empire, 1324. A caravan is crossing the Sahara on its way to Mecca. The numbers in the surviving accounts are huge, and we should take them with the same caution we take every medieval number. Arab chroniclers like al-Imari, writing 12 years after the event from interviews with people who'd been in Cairo at the time, describe something on the order of tens of thousands of people, hundreds of camels loaded with gold dust, servants carrying gold staves, an armed escort of cavalry, livestock to feed the procession along the way. The exact tonnage is unknowable. The order of magnitude, extraordinary even by the standards of medieval royal pilgrimages, is well attested. At the head of the caravan rides Mansa Musa Keita I, king of Mali. He stops in Cairo for 3 months on his way to Mecca. He hands out gold to the poor. He gives gold to the Mamluk Sultan's court. He buys things, a lot of things, and pays in gold for all of them. and he distributes so much of it that he distorts the Cairo gold market. This part is real and documented. Al-Umari, writing in the 1330s, reports that the price of gold in Cairo dropped noticeably after Musa's visit and stayed depressed for years. Modern economic historians have looked at this carefully, and the consensus is that yes, this happened. A single visitor's spending genuinely affected the regional bullion market. How long the depression lasted is debated. Estimates range from several years to about a decade. The exact percentage drop is harder to pin down because medieval price data is patchy. But Mansa Musa moved the gold market is not folklore, it's history. Now, the part you've seen on social media. Mansa Musa was the richest person who ever lived, worth $400 billion. Where does that come from? A 2012 article on the website Celebrity Net Worth, picked up and recirculated by Money Magazine, Time, and 1,000 listicles after that. The methodology was, to be polite, loose. Trying to convert the wealth of a 14th century African emperor into modern dollars runs into a fundamental problem. Medieval wealth and modern wealth aren't comparable. Mansa Musa controlled access to a significant share of West African gold production, but he didn't have a portfolio, a market cap, or liquid assets in any modern sense. Serious economic historians have spent the last decade trying to walk this claim back. The honest version is that Mansa Musa was almost certainly one of the wealthiest rulers of the medieval world, on roughly the same scale as the contemporary Chinese emperor or the Mamluk sultan. The richest human being who ever lived is a viral framing, not a research finding. What's actually impressive about Mali doesn't need the inflated number. The empire at its peak covered around 1 million square kilometers of West Africa, stretching from the Atlantic coast of modern Senegal across to western Niger, and from the Sahara south to the forest belt. It controlled 2 of the richest gold fields of the medieval world, Bambouk and Beret, on the upper Senegal and Niger rivers, and sat at the southern end of the Trans-Saharan trade network. African gold moved north through Mali to North Africa, Egypt, and on into Europe. Modern estimates suggest West African gold made up a major share, possibly close to half in some periods, of the gold circulating in the wider Mediterranean and Islamic economies during the 14th century. The exact percentage shifts depending on which year, which source, and which historian, but the order of magnitude is real. A lot of the gold that ended up in Venetian ducats and Florentine florins started its journey in a Malian river valley. The empire was founded around 1235 by Sundiata Keita, whose life story was preserved by professional oral historians, Jeliv, often translated as griots, and circulated in performance for centuries before being transcribed in the 20th. The Epic of Sundiata is one of the major works of African oral literature. Calling it comparable to the Iliad gets the prestige register right, but flattens what's distinct about a living oral tradition that was still being performed in the 20th century by named lineage holders in front of audiences who knew the words. Mansa Musa came to power around 1312. On his way back from Mecca, he didn't just spend gold, he recruited. The most famous case is an Andalusian poet and architect named Al-Sahili, who came back to Mali with the caravan. How much Al-Sahili personally shaped Sudano-Sahelian architecture is debated by art historians. Older accounts credited him with introducing the style basically single-handedly, while newer work treats him as one influence within an already developing local tradition. The mud brick mosques of Djenné and Timbuktu, with their projecting wooden beams and pyramidal minarets, belong to that tradition. The Great Mosque of Djenné, rebuilt in 1907 on much older foundations, is the largest mud brick building in the world. That part is uncontested. And then there's Timbuktu. The popular image of Timbuktu in English is a synonym for the middle of nowhere. That image is wrong, and the correction is worth getting right. Timbuktu under Mali and later under Songhai was a major commercial and scholarly city. The Sankore Madrasa, along with Jingareber and Sidi Yahya, formed the core of a teaching network. Not a single university in the modern sense, but a cluster of mosques and private scholarly households where students came to read with named teachers and receive certificates. Estimates of the student population vary wildly. The often repeated figure of 25,000 students comes from popular sources and is almost certainly inflated. More cautious academic estimates put the scholarly population in the low thousands at its peak, in a city whose total population probably topped out somewhere between 30,000 and 80,000. That's still extraordinary. A medium-sized West African city in the 15th century with multiple thousands of working scholars in active correspondence with Cairo, Fez, and Mecca is not a footnote. The curriculum covered Quranic studies, Islamic law, Arabic grammar and rhetoric, logic, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, and history. The libraries, private family collections mostly, not centralized institutional ones, held tens of thousands of manuscripts, possibly hundreds of thousands across the whole city over the centuries. We know this because most of those manuscripts still exist. In 2012, jihadist groups occupied northern Mali and started destroying cultural heritage in Timbuktu, including manuscripts. What happens next is one of the great preservation stories of recent history. Local families, librarians, and a coordinator named Abdel Kader Haidara organized the smuggling of around 350,000 manuscripts south to Bamako, packed in metal trunks and rice sacks, moved by car, boat, and donkey, hidden along the route, all while the city was under armed occupation. They saved the collection. Cataloging is ongoing right now by researchers in Bamako, Cape Town, and Hamburg. We are still finding out what those manuscripts contain. What's already clear is that 14th and 15th century West African scholars were writing about astronomy, mathematics, law, ethics, medicine, history, and the practical management of cities and trade, at a level of sophistication that destroys the older European image of medieval Africa as a continent without writing or scholarship. That image, by the way, isn't a neutral oversight. It was constructed deliberately in 19th and early 20th century European writing, partly to justify the colonial project then underway. The factual record was bent on purpose. Pointing this out isn't about scoring points against medieval Europe, which had its own scholarly centers and its own significant universities. Paris and Bologna and Oxford were real, large, and intellectually productive. It's about straightening a record that was knocked out of true. Mali declined through the 15th century, weakened by succession disputes, Tuareg raids out of the desert, and pressure from a rising power on its eastern flank, which is the next entry on this list. Number 3. The Songhai Empire, 1468. Timbuktu. A new ruler is approaching, Soni Ali Bear. He has spent the last 4 years pushing west along the Niger, swallowing the eastern provinces of the collapsing Mali Empire. Timbuktu, with its scholars and its libraries and its commercial wealth, is the prize. The scholars of Sankore had aligned themselves with the Tuareg who'd been controlling the city. Soni Ali takes Timbuktu by force, and he treats the scholarly establishment harshly. Executions, confiscations, exile. The Arabic chroniclers of the city, themselves members of the class he persecuted, write his obituary in advance and don't pull punches. He comes down to us through the Tariq al-Sudan and the Tariq al-Fatash as a tyrant, an unbeliever, a destroyer of pious men. The political reality was messier than the chronicles let on. Soni Ali was building a state, and the scholars had backed the other side in a war he won. The clergy wrote the history. The conqueror has been losing the PR fight ever since. What he actually built, his successors expanded into the largest state in West African history. Sunni Ali died in 1492, the same year, yes, that Columbus crossed the Atlantic. The coincidence is striking, and we'll come back to it. Within months, one of his generals, Muhammad Touré, overthrew Sunni Ali's son and took the throne. He adopted the title Askia, and as Askia Muhammad, he ruled until 1528. Under him, Songhai reached roughly 1.4 million square kilometers, larger than Mali at its peak, stretching from the Atlantic into modern Niger, from the Saharan salt mines of Tagaza south to the woodlands. Askia Muhammad's administrative reforms were genuinely sophisticated by the standards of any contemporary state. Salaried provincial governors rotated through their posts to prevent them from building local power bases. A central treasury, standardized weights and measures, tax assessment based on agricultural output, a professional military with cavalry, infantry, and a river navy on the Niger. Saying this is a modern state in West Africa in 1500 is a bit much. Early modern European bureaucracies were also far from modern in our sense, and so was the Ottoman administration of the same period. The fair comparison is that Songhai's machinery of government was in the same league as the major Eurasian states of its day. That's the impressive part, and it doesn't need exaggeration. Askia Muhammad made his own pilgrimage to Mecca in 1496. Less spectacular than Mansa Musa's, more carefully managed, he did not crash any markets. In Cairo, he was formally recognized as Caliph of the Western Sudan by the Abbasid shadow caliph living under Mamluk protection, which gave him a kind of pan-Islamic prestige his predecessors hadn't claimed. And he invested in Timbuktu. Sankore was rebuilt and expanded. The scholar Ahmad Baba, born in Timbuktu in 1556 in the late Songhai period, wrote more than 40 works on Islamic law, biography, theology, and grammar. His personal library held 1,600 volumes, and he mentions in one of his writings that this was actually a small library by the standards of his colleagues. Other Timbuktu scholars had larger collections. According to the chronicler Leo Africanus, who visited around 1510, the book trade in Timbuktu was extremely profitable. Whether literally more profitable than gold or salt, as the famous quote often gets paraphrased, is a stretch from what he actually wrote, which was that more profit is made from the sale of books than from any other branch of trade. That's still a striking sentence about a city sitting on a continental gold route, even without the social media gloss. Then, in 1591, the world built around that book trade comes apart. 4,000 kilometers north, the Sultan of Morocco, Ahmad al-Mansur, looks south. Morocco has just defeated a Portuguese invasion at the Battle of the Three Kings in 1578, taken a huge ransom in the aftermath, and al-Mansur has money and ambition to spare. He wants the gold of the Niger Valley. He sends an army across the Sahara, around 4,000 men. The force is unusual in its composition. A large proportion are not Moroccans, but European converts and renegades, including many Iberians, recruited and equipped as gunpowder troops. They carry matchlock arquebuses and light field artillery. The Songhai do not. The two forces meet at Tondabi in March 1591. The Songhai field army is much larger. Sources give figures around 40,000, though as always with medieval numbers, we should be cautious. And fighting on home ground. They have cavalry, archers, infantry, every conventional advantage. The popular story is that the Moroccans fired one volley. The Songhai horses panicked and the battle was over. The reality, from the chronicles, is closer to this. The Songhai initially advanced and inflicted casualties, but the firearms and the artillery shifted the engagement decisively. The discipline of the Songhai line broke under sustained gunpowder fire from a force they had no good answer to. The battle wasn't a single volley rout. It was a several-hour collapse of a force that had never trained to face this kind of weapon. Either way, the outcome was catastrophic. Songhai's main field army was destroyed in a single day. 4,000 men with guns broke a state of several million people. Not because the Songhai were weak, because a technological gap had opened over the previous century. Gunpowder weapons, developed first in China, refined in the Islamic world, mass-produced and tactically integrated in Europe and the Ottoman Empire. And Songhai had been on the wrong side of trade routes that didn't deliver them. The Moroccans took Timbuktu. They arrested the scholars and shipped many of them, including Ahmad Baba, to Marrakesh in chains. Baba spent 12 years in exile teaching Moroccan students before being allowed to return home. His writing from that period contains one of the most quoted lines in West African intellectual history. "Of all my friends, I had the fewest books, and when they took them from me, I had 1,600 volumes." The Moroccan occupation never really worked as a government. The supply lines back to Marrakesh were too long, the climate too hostile, and within a couple of generations, the occupiers had assimilated into local society, intermarried, and lost meaningful contact with the metropole. But the unified Songhai state never came back. The empire fragmented into smaller successor states, the Pashalik of Timbuktu, the Dendi Kingdom, others, and the center of West African economic gravity began to drift south, toward the Atlantic coast, where Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French traders were building a different kind of commercial system. That system, increasingly, was the Atlantic slave trade. It's worth being clear about the chain of consequences here, because the popular framing of Tondibi caused colonialism 3 centuries later is too tight. The fall of Songhai didn't directly cause European partition of Africa. A lot happened in between. But the geopolitical fact is real. In the same century that Spain conquered the Aztec and Inca empires, the largest state in West Africa was broken by a gunpowder army that crossed the Sahara. The technological gap between gunpowder-producing societies and the rest wasn't just a European story. It was a global one, and it had already done damage in Africa long before the formal colonial period began in the 19th century. The fall of Songhai is one of the undertold turning points of the 16th century world. The standard narrative of the 1500s, Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, the Reformation, the rise of Habsburg Spain, leaves it out. In the same century, the largest African state north of the equator rose, peaked, and was destroyed by guns. That belongs in the picture. Number 2. The Timurid Empire, 1398, the outskirts of Delhi. A man in his 60s, walking with a limp that's followed him his whole adult life, sits on a horse and watches his army finish what it came to do. The Sultanate of Delhi, the dominant Muslim power in northern India for nearly 2 centuries, has just been broken. The city behind him is being sacked. The sources describe pyramids of severed heads outside the walls and tens of thousands of prisoners executed in a single day because the army couldn't safely move them. The man's name is Timur. In English, he's better known by the Persian nickname his enemies gave him, Timur the Lame, Tamerlane. He's one of the most violent conquerors in recorded history, and he's also the founder of a dynasty that within 3 generations becomes one of the great patrons of art, science, and architecture the world has ever seen. Both of those things are true. Most popular accounts pick one. Timur was born around 1336 in Transoxiana, roughly modern Uzbekistan, into a minor Turco-Mongol noble family. He spent his 20s as a kind of warlord mercenary, fighting in the chaotic aftermath of the Chagatai Khanate's collapse. He took an arrow to the leg and an injury to the right arm in his 30s, in fighting that may have been against a rival warlord, or possibly during livestock raiding. The sources disagree. He limped for the rest of his life. By 1370, he'd consolidated power in Samarkand. By 1405, when he died on campaign on the way to invade Ming China, his empire stretched from the Aegean to the borders of India and from the Persian Gulf to the steppes of Kazakhstan. The body count he left behind is genuinely staggering. The traditional figure of 17 million dead, sometimes claimed as 5% of the world's population at the time, comes from older popular histories and isn't really defensible from primary sources. Modern historians treat the number as an extrapolation rather than a finding. What's documented is bad enough. Major cities: Isfahan, Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, Delhi, sacked with massacres in the tens of thousands. Whole regions of Iran and the Caucasus depopulated. The towers of skulls outside the cities he took are attested by multiple independent sources, including a Castilian ambassador, Ruy González de Clavijo, who visited Samarkand in 1404 and left a detailed memoir. Then, in 1402, near Ankara, Timur did something that has fascinated and frustrated historians ever since. He defeated and captured the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I. This matters because Bayezid, 2 years earlier, had been on the verge of taking Constantinople. The walls of the Byzantine capital had held off Ottoman pressure for decades, but the city's resources were exhausted, and another sustained siege would probably have ended it. Bayezid had been preparing exactly that campaign when Timur came west. After Ankara, the Ottoman Empire fell into an 11-year civil war among Bayezid's sons. Constantinople got a reprieve. Now, did Timur save the Byzantine Empire? This is one of those counterfactuals that's irresistible and unprovable. The reprieve was real. Constantinople didn't fall until 1453, half a century later. Whether Bayezid would have taken the city in 1402 or 1403 if Timur hadn't intervened is genuinely uncertain. The Byzantines had survived close calls before. What we can say is that the half-century of breathing room the city got between Ankara and the final Ottoman conquest under Mehmed II was the period when Byzantine scholars carried Greek manuscripts west to Italy in significant numbers. Many of those scholars left during the long crisis, and especially after 1453, but the trickle had begun earlier. That transfer of texts is part of what fed the later phases of the Italian Renaissance. So, Timur, the man who built skull towers from Anatolia to India, indirectly contributed to the Western European intellectual revival. History doesn't owe anyone a clean moral story. He died in February 1405 in a place called Otrar on the Sir Darya in modern Kazakhstan during the dead of winter, on the march east toward Ming China. He was about 68. We don't know how the campaign would have gone. The Ming had recently come to power, had a large army and a settled bureaucracy, and weren't an easy target. But Timur had taken on long odds before. What happens after his death is the part of the story that most outside Central Asia haven't heard. His sons fight, as expected. The empire fragments. But one of his grandsons, named Ulugh Beg, ends up ruling Samarkand and the surrounding region from 1409 to 1449. Ulugh Beg is one of the more unusual rulers in medieval history because he was, by training and by genuine interest, an astronomer. He built an observatory in Samarkand around 1424, 3 stories tall, with a sextant carved into the bedrock that was 40 meters long. At the time, the largest astronomical instrument ever constructed. He worked there himself, alongside professional astronomers he'd recruited from across the Islamic world. The catalog they produced, the Zigi Sultani, listed more than 1,000 stars, with positions measured with an accuracy that wasn't surpassed in Europe for nearly 2 centuries, until Tycho Brahe in the late 1500s. Ulugh Beg was murdered in 1449 by his own son after a palace coup. The observatory was destroyed by religious conservatives shortly after. The site was lost for almost 5 centuries and only rediscovered by a Russian archaeologist in 1908. The underground portion of the sextant is still there, in Samarkand, and you can walk down into it. Samarkand under the Timurids was rebuilt on a scale meant to declare a civilizational claim. The Registan Square, the Shah-e-Zindan necropolis, the Gur-e-Amir Mausoleum where Timur is buried. These are some of the great achievements of Islamic architecture, with vast tiled domes and portals that influence everything from Isfahan to Mughal India. Which brings us to the Mughals. In 1526, more than a century after Timur's death, a descendant of his, on his father's side, with Genghis Khan on his mother's, named Babur, crossed into India and won the Battle of Panipat. He founded the dynasty that built the Mughal Empire, which at its height controlled most of the Indian subcontinent and was, in the 17th century, one of the wealthiest states on earth. Some economic historians estimate its share of global GDP at around 20 to 25%, comparable to Qing China. The Mughals called themselves Timurids. They meant it as a claim to legitimacy and lineage, and they meant it culturally. The architecture they patronized, the Red Fort, Humayun's tomb, the Taj Mahal, descends directly from the Timurid school of Samarkand, with additional Persian and Indian elements layered in. The Taj Mahal is a Mughal synthesis, not a copy of any one source. Calling it essentially Timurid gets the lineage right, but flattens the genuine creative work of 17th century Indian craftsmen and architects. So the chain is a warlord from Uzbekistan in the 1300s, his grandson the astronomer in the 1400s, a great-great-great-grandson who took India in the 1500s, and the buildings that grandson's descendants put up in the 1600s, which are now some of the most recognizable images of India in the world. The Timurids ran a remarkable 2-century experiment in which the same dynastic family produced both world-class violence and world-class scholarship. The honest version isn't to pick one, it's to hold both, and to ask what kind of social structures allow that combination to keep recurring across history. It's not just a Timurid question. Number 1. The Abbasid Caliphate, 762 AD. The west bank of the Tigris. A man named Al-Mansur, the second Abbasid Caliph, the dynasty's real organizer, is laying out a city. Not a quarter, not an expansion of an existing town. A new capital, built from nothing, on a site he chose personally after months of inspection. The plan is a perfect circle. 3 concentric rings of walls, 4 gates oriented to the cardinal directions. At the center, the Caliph's palace and the Great Mosque. He calls it Madinat as-Salam, the City of Peace. Everyone else calls it by the name of the village that used to be there, Baghdad. Within 50 years, Baghdad is one of the largest cities in the world. Population estimates for the early 9th century vary, but most modern historians put it somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million, depending on how you draw the urban boundary. At the lower end, it's comparable to the largest Chinese capitals. At the upper end, it surpasses them. For roughly 2 centuries, it sits in the top tier of world cities, alongside Constantinople, Chang'an, and Cordoba. That last comparison matters. Cordoba is Umayyad, the dynasty the Abbasids overthrew in 750, which survived in Iberia and built its own brilliant civilization in parallel. The Islamic world wasn't one polity. Saying the Abbasids sometimes flattens this. By the 900s, the formal caliphate's real political control had shrunk dramatically. Egypt broke away under the Fatimids, Iran under various dynasties, and from 945 onward, the caliph in Baghdad was a religious figurehead, while real power belonged to a series of military strongmen. The cultural and scientific flowering associated with the name Abbasid actually depended on many courts. Baghdad, yes, but also Cordoba, Cairo under the Fatimids, Bukhara under the Samanids, and others. When people say Islamic Golden Age, they're describing a network, not one capital. But Baghdad was the network's center of gravity for a long time, and what happened there is worth getting right. Start with the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. Older popular accounts describe this as a vast central institution, part library, part academy, part translation bureau, founded by Harun al-Rashid in the late 700s and expanded by his son al-Mamun in the early 800s, employing dozens of paid translators rendering Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Sanskrit scientific and philosophical works into Arabic. Newer scholarship has been more cautious. The historian Dimitri Gutas, among others, has argued that the Beit al-Hikmah was a more modest royal library, primarily focused on Persian administrative and historical texts, and that the Greek into Arabic translation movement was a broader, decentralized phenomenon driven by demand from elite patrons, caliphs, viziers, wealthy families across the Abbasid world, not concentrated in one institution. This sounds like a downgrade. It isn't. What it actually means is that the translation movement was bigger and more deeply rooted than a single building could explain. Across the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, scholars working in Baghdad, Basra, Damascus, and elsewhere translated almost the entire surviving corpus of Greek mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy into Arabic, along with significant Persian and Indian material. They worked from older Syriac translations, from Greek originals carried in by Byzantine prisoners and gifts, from manuscripts bought in Constantinople with caliphal money. The Hunayn ibn Ishaq school alone translated dozens of Galen's medical works to a standard that's still considered exemplary. And, this is the part that gets missed in some retellings, they didn't just translate. They corrected, extended, and in many cases produced original work that surpassed what they'd received. A few names worth knowing. Al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad in the early 9th century. His book on the Indian numerals, the system we still call Arabic numerals, including the use of zero, is the route by which that system entered Europe. His book, Al-Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, gives us the word algebra, and the discipline it describes is a genuine synthesis. It takes elements from Greek geometry, Indian arithmetic, and Babylonian problem-solving traditions, and produces something new, a systematic method for solving equations that didn't exist in any of the source traditions in that form. The Latinization of his name is the root of the word algorithm. Ibn al-Haytham, born in Basra around 965, working mostly in Cairo under Fatimid patronage. His Kitab al-Manazir, the Book of Optics, did several things that mattered. It correctly argued that vision works by light entering the eye, not by something emitted from the eye, which had been the dominant Greek view. It used controlled experiments, covered windows, pinhole apertures, geometric setups, to test hypotheses about light, in a methodology that later European scientists, including Roger Bacon and ultimately Kepler, drew on directly. Calling him the inventor of the scientific method is too strong. Experimental methods have multiple roots and a long developmental arc. But he's a serious figure in that lineage, and the Book of Optics, in its Latin translation, was studied in European universities for centuries. Ibn Sina, known in Latin as Avicenna, born near Bukhara in 980. His Canon of Medicine compiled and extended Greek, Persian, and Indian medical knowledge into a systematic textbook that was used in European medical faculties through the 1600s. His philosophical work on metaphysics and the soul shaped Thomas Aquinas, who cites him by name. Al-Razi, Rhazes, a Persian physician who wrote in Arabic, the first to distinguish smallpox from measles clinically, and one of the first writers to apply systematic empirical observation to medical case histories. Al-Biruni, working at the court of Mahmud of Ghazni in the early 1000s. calculated the radius of the Earth using trigonometry from a single mountaintop with an error of around 200 kilometers, about 1%. Wrote a comparative study of Indian religion, Tahqiq Malil Hind, that's still considered a foundational text in the comparative study of cultures. And Maryam al-Astrulabiyya, working in Aleppo in the 10th century, one of the named makers of astrolabes, precision astronomical instruments that European navigators would use for centuries. That list is partial. The actual roster runs to thousands of named figures across 3 or 4 centuries. Now, what does this have to do with the European Renaissance? The popular framing is, without the Abbasids, no Renaissance. The end. That overstates the case in one direction, and the older Eurocentric framing, that the Renaissance was a self-generated European miracle drawing solely on rediscovered classical sources, overstates it in the other. The honest picture is mixed, and it includes Byzantium, which both framings tend to underplay. A meaningful share of Greek scientific and philosophical texts reached medieval and Renaissance Europe through Arabic translation and commentary, especially in the 11th through 13th centuries, through translation centers in Toledo in Spain and in Norman Sicily. Some texts, particularly in medicine, astronomy, optics, and mathematics, circulated in Latin Europe primarily in their Arabic-derived forms for centuries. Aristotle's natural philosophy reached the medieval universities largely through Arabic commentary, especially that of Ibn Rushd, known in Latin as Averroes. But Byzantium had also preserved Greek texts continuously, in Greek the entire time. When the Byzantine Empire entered its terminal crisis in the 14th and 15th centuries, and especially after Constantinople fell in 1453, Greek-speaking scholars carried manuscripts to Italy and taught at Italian courts and universities. The Italian Renaissance drew on both streams, Arabic-derived translations that had been digested for centuries, and a new wave of direct Greek transmission from Byzantine refugees. So the accurate version is, the European Renaissance had multiple roots, including indigenous developments in late medieval European thought, Byzantine Greek transmission, and the Arabic translation and commentary tradition. The Abbasid era work is a major root, not the only root, and not optional. Without it, large parts of medieval and early modern European science would have been built on much thinner foundations, especially in mathematics, astronomy, optics, and medicine. That's the defensible version. There's also a story you may have heard, that when European scholars wanted Greek manuscripts in the 1100s, they had to come to Baghdad to find them, sometimes ones the Byzantines had lost or weren't using. The reality is more complicated. Translations did happen on a major scale at Toledo and elsewhere, from Arabic into Latin. Direct Greek to Latin translation was also happening, especially in Sicily and southern Italy. Both routes mattered. The claim that Byzantium had the books but did nothing with them is wrong. Byzantine scholars worked actively with Greek texts the whole time. Their tradition was just oriented toward different questions than the Latin West was asking. The Abbasid Caliphate's central authority crumbled gradually. The Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258, when Hulagu's army took the city and killed the last caliph, is often used as the symbolic endpoint, and it's a real catastrophe. The chronicles describe the Tigris running black with ink from the books thrown into it. Even allowing for rhetorical exaggeration, an irreplaceable share of the city's libraries was destroyed. But the scholarly tradition didn't die in 1258. Major work continued. In Cairo, in Damascus, in Maraga in Iran, where Nasir al-Din al-Tusi built an observatory under the very Mongols who just sacked Baghdad, in Samarkand under Ulugh Beg, in Istanbul under the Ottomans, in Mughal India. The Islamic Golden Age label is itself a simplification. There was no single age that opened and closed on specific dates. There was a long, geographically distributed, continuously evolving scientific and philosophical tradition that peaked in different places at different times, and whose contributions to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, and philosophy are an ineliminable part of how the modern world got built. That's why the Abbasids are number one. Not because they invented everything, and not because Europe was a darkness without them. Because for several centuries, the Arabic-speaking world was where the global conversation in science and philosophy was happening at its highest intensity. Drawing on Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese sources, and producing original work that fed forward into everything that came next. Modern science doesn't have a single origin point, but any honest map of how we got here runs through Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, Bukhara, and Samarkand. Erasing that route is one of the longest-running errors in popular history. 10 empires. Most of them I learned about properly only after I'd left school, which is a strange thing to admit on a list like this. The standard curriculum I grew up with, and probably you too, global dominance look natural and inevitable rather than recent and contingent. The corrective isn't to flip the story and pretend Europe contributed nothing. The medieval European universities were real. The Renaissance was real. The scientific revolution was real. None of those things would have been possible in the form they took without contributions from outside Europe. But they also weren't just passive recipients. They were sites of genuine creation. The corrective is to widen the map. Civilizations sat on top of each other for thousands of years. The Buddha got his human face from sculptors working in a Greek-influenced school under a Central Asian dynasty descended from people pushed west by Chinese frontier wars. Algebra entered Europe through translations of an Arabic textbook that drew on Indian arithmetic and Greek geometry. The Mughal aesthetic that produced the Taj Mahal descends from a Timurid school in Samarkand, where an astronomer king built an observatory whose star catalog wasn't beaten in Europe until Tycho Brahe. None of these are isolated stories. They're all the same story, told in pieces. The empires I picked aren't the only ones that deserve more attention. Ethiopia, the Khmer, Srivijaya, the Silla and Goryeo dynasties of Korea, Great Zimbabwe, the Inca, who get more attention than they used to, but still less than they earned, Vijayanagara in South India, the Ottomans, who are sometimes treated as the empire that lost World War I, rather than the 600-year power they actually were, the Russian Empire, whose scale and complexity Western audiences still tend to underestimate. That's a list for another time. For now, 10 is enough. Thanks for watching this far. If something here was new, that's the point. If something here was wrong, and there are things in any history this compressed that scholars will quarrel about, the comments are open, and corrections from people who actually work on these periods are more welcome than agreement. History isn't a settled book. It's an argument that's still being had. The most useful thing we can do is make sure the argument includes everyone who was actually in the room. Glad you watched until the end. I put a lot of effort into making this video. I'll be waiting for you again. Bye.